Okay. Thank you, Benson, for stage managing us always with all these events. This is not easy, and of course, it requires a lot of preparation to get us all together. So, thanks for that, Benson, for all your important substantive and logistical work background. I'm von Schweinfest. I'm the director of the UN Statistics Division, and I'm very happy in this early morning in New York, but late somewhere else in the planet, to welcome you for the second and also concluding Housing Sprint webinar of the United Nations Network of Economic Statisticians. Of course, as good statisticians, we like our numbers. So let me give you right away one number that we had over 150 participants in the first sprint on this topic a few weeks ago. So that's a good indication that we are doing our job of connecting what I like to call like-minded people around the world, even though we have very different time zones and it's dark here for a different reason than it's in Jackie's world here. It's the beginning of the day. Jackie is already at the end of her day. So thanks for all connecting throughout the world. The sprint, of course, has been possible, as I said earlier, thanking Benson to the hard work of planning of a task team behind the scene. And here I just in particular want to mention our dear colleagues from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. You will see that in this opening, after I have spoken, it will get very Australian with Jackie and Jonathan leading us substantively into the topic, but also, of course, Statistics Canada and the Maldives Bureau of Statistics as the lead of the network in general, and of course, our friends and colleagues in UN Habitat. So this team has had many meetings in the background to come up with this agenda to reach out to the people and that will be speaking and sharing today. So I also wanted to thank those presenters for their contributions at this table. We will hear a more substantive takeaway from the first sprint, but let me just say, in terms of context, housing is, of course, a very fundamental human need, but it is very much more so than something individual. It is the foundation also of community well-being. And that makes it interesting and challenging to measure because it's such a multidimensional has so many multidimensional aspects that transcend simply the fact of physical sheltering. We can think of the importance for life in general, for health, for economic stability, for social interactions, cultural identity, environmental sustainability, and of course also psychological well-being. So because of this centrality to human life, understanding and measuring and reflecting housing issues correctly is crucial for any society aiming to improve the overall quality of life and ensuring equitable growth and development. I'm very happy to hear that this group is also working on a primer to making the case for an international housing statistics framework. The idea is to have a first draft ready very, very soon and circulate among some close friends and then present it to the Statistical Commission in 2025 as a background document to the discussions of the network of economic statisticians, and also as an example of a very concrete outcome that we achieve when the right people across the world connect with each other. I also had the pleasure just 2 days ago to open the first session of our new expert group on well-being measurement that came also out of an effort of this network, namely after the series of Beyond GDP sprints 2023. And I'm absolutely confident that your work and your reflections here will also contribute to this expert group on well-being measurement. So I'm looking very much forward to you this morning, today, this evening, sharing your ideas, your backgrounds, your knowledge and expertise, as we traditionally do as a global statistical community. And I wish you all a successful meeting. And now I hand over to Jackie Vitas, who has kindly agreed to substantively guide and chair this webinar in the morning to provide further information on the agenda. Thank you very much and welcome everybody.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I'm Jackie Vitas. As Stefan has said, I'm the General Manager of the Economy and Environment Division at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And it's my great pleasure to chair this second Housing Sprint webinar. As Stefan said, housing is obviously a critical element to a wide range of things from a society and an economic perspective. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentations today and also the panel discussion. Jono, as Stefan said, will give us a bit of an overview of some of the key takeaways from the first webinar. So after my introductions, I'll pass to Jono. And then following that, we're going to have 4 presentations from Australia, Canada, OECD, and the UN, and then go into a panel discussion focusing on data integration as a foundation for developing a housing framework. And I think there's 3 kind of key objectives really in this webinar is providing examples of housing indicators needed and also produced, the challenges in producing data on housing, and also some of the innovative approaches that we might be already using, but we could be considering in the future as well. So I'm very much hoping that having this webinar is going to help us, give us some thought-provoking things that we can take away to our institutions, but also is going to help us build, hopefully, this framework that we can start utilising to think about housing statistics. So I'm going to pass to Jono now to give us a summary of the outcome from the first webinar. So Jono.
Thanks so much, Jackie. So my name is Jono Khoo. I am the Program Manager in charge of the Physical Environment Accounts and Statistics branch at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And my responsibility includes some of our housing statistics particularly as they relate to the demand side of the supply side of housing in terms of things like building construction approvals. As Jackie mentioned, I had the privilege of co-chairing the first sprint with Stefan, which was held on the 26th of June. And I wanted to just give a little bit of a brief summary of that for people who may not have been able to attend. It was a very good meeting, and I certainly encourage you to there's a recording that is available online from the UN website, and if you're interested to find out more details, I'd encourage you to have a look at that as well. So the title of the first webinar in the housing sprint was a multi-dimensional integrated housing framework for the future. And what it explored was the development of a comprehensive housing statistics framework to assist in the monitoring, understanding, and addressing the multifaceted issues associated with housing across various regions and socioeconomic context. So there were sort of 2 broad sessions. The first session looked to try to have a bit of an understanding of user needs and build the case for why housing data matters from the point of view of policymakers and other users. So we heard from reflections on some of the current challenges across the globe that are being faced. Some of these include things like population growth, land constraints, legislative issues, skill shortages, and the impact of climate change. And we also covered some of the key data needs and challenges in that space. So just to go through some of the presenters that we heard from His Excellency Dr. Ali Hadir Ahmed, who's the Minister of Housing, Land and Urban Development from the Maldives. And he talked on the housing scenario and issues in the Maldives, where significant gaps in both housing supply and demand have highlighted the importance of data-driven housing policy and evidence-based decision-making. We heard from Kurt Uzovsky, who was from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, and he presented the US housing data landscape and some of the complexities involved in housing market analyses, including the increased use of private sector data and challenges around subnational data sets and the partnerships that need to be undertaken to identify and utilize those data sets. And finally, in the first session, we also heard from Jonathan Hamber, who's from the Reserve Bank of Australia, and he explained the role of monetary policy in the Australian housing market and how integrated data can help us to challenge assumptions around policy effects, wealth and inequality, and rental dynamics. The second session, I guess, sort of took that sort of user needs as a starting point to take a bit more of a deep dive in looking at a potential framework, and we heard from Jean-Philippe Deschamps-Laporte, who presented the Statistics Canada framework for housing. For framework for housing statistics. This framework joins the perspectives of social, economic and environmental lenses together and details a model for the organisation of housing dimensions, concepts and indicators. The framework is meant to provide guidance for national statistics officers, international bodies, policymakers and data users to help frame housing issues, guide analysis and support data development. So the final reflection I'll just have is, I guess, in terms of the overall sort of highlights, and I think the key sort of take home message was that the webinar highlighted the multidimensional nature of housing, influencing nearly every aspect of life, and how critical it is to understand and articulate these concepts in order to properly measure them. Given the significance and complexity of housing, a framework is really essential for transforming data into actionable insights that lead to meaningful improvements in housing conditions, both from the global level, but also right down to the local level. And I think that serves as a really great introduction to this webinar, which will look more at innovative methods and approaches for developing housing statistics. So that's a bit of a summary of the state of play from the first webinar. Jackie, I'll hand back to you for the presentations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jono, and I think that's a really good scene setting for this second webinar. So we've got 4 presentations now. Each presenter will have 20 minutes to present. We hopefully will have about 10 minutes at the end of those presentations to have any discussion, any questions that people would like to raise. But I'd also like to invite people to, if they have any questions, to put them in the chat. And if we don't have enough time, then presenters could respond to some of those questions or maybe follow up with people after the webinar, a good way of building your network. So I'm going to start off then with introducing our first presenter and the title of their presentation. So Ros Watmuth who's the Director of Census Administrative Data Ventures at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, is going to give us a presentation on the Administrative Data Snapshot, Experimental Housing Statistics from Linked Administrative Data. So Ross, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Jackie, and hello from sunny Australia. It's not very sunny here at the moment though, because it's 10 p.m. at night, so but great to be with you all. And as Jackie said, yeah, my team works for the Australian Census, and our role is essentially to use administrative data sources to support how we run our census. Most people think of the census as being about population, but it is a census of population and housing, and that's how I've ended up presenting in this forum. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my slides. Okay, it should be coming through now. So this presentation will be in two parts.
Sorry,
the
Ross,
first
it's
part-
sorry, Ross, before you go, it's
Yeah.
Jono here. We can see your presenter view. So you might just split on the display settings.
You're using two monitors, right? Yeah.
How's that?
Looks good.
Great.
Thanks,
great,
Ross.
yeah.
Apologies for that. So yeah, the presentation's in two parts. The first part is an overview of this new experimental product we've released called the Administrative Data Snapshot, and I'll be covering that very quickly. I've got quite a bit in the slides, but it's really there so that you can go back and refer to some of it and just get a full coverage. And the second part of the presentation will be a focusing on some experimental dwelling activity or vacancy statistics that we've produced as part of this. So essentially, there's two types of data that our team is using to support the Australian census, two types of linked administrative data. The first is all linked person level data, and we have an integrated data asset at the ABS that will probably be discussed later, called our person level integrated data asset, and that covers data from the year 2006 up to the present, and is essentially an amalgamation of data from our tax registrations, our health administration, and government benefit administration. On the linked housing data side, we have an address register in the ABS that supports various collections. We used some electricity data at a dwelling level for the census, and then we created various address level derivations of the blue person level data to support the census. And in supporting a census, because this data goes back a long way, we need to actually sort of create a snapshot of those data assets at a point in time, at the time of the census. So we created a population snapshot and a housing snapshot. The kinds of things we used those assets for were to substitute counts for missing responses in the census, use it as a quality assurance check, help predict whether houses were occupied on census night so that we could decide whether to impute those households. And after the census, we felt that these data assets were a valuable asset in their own right, and that would be worth releasing it as an experimental product. So that's what this is about. And we released that last year in 2023. So here it is. It's called the Administrative Data Snapshot. And essentially, we're creating a census-like data set, but purely from administrative data sources. And the idea with this snapshot is that we would try and assign every person in the person snapshot to a house on the housing snapshot. Now, I'll quickly talk about this idea of scoping. So like I said, the data goes back in time a long way. So how do you create a snapshot that only represents people at the time of the census? So there's a number of steps here, but I'm just going to whip through them very quickly. And it's best shown here using an age distribution chart. So you can see the green there represents the ages of all people on that linked person data asset. And there's about 36.7 million people going back to 2006. Whereas the red line we have there is our official population estimate of that year, which is only about 25.7 million people. So the question is, can we remove those excess people above the red line? So firstly, if we remove people who have a flag of being deceased, we remove that green portion. Next, we can remove that purple hump in the middle there using border records, people moving within and out of the country. But we've still got this small amount of blue above the red line. And we can remove most of that by just examining whether those people have been active recently in government data. So as you can see, we can get very, very close to our official population estimate using this administrative data and scoping it down. That blue line you can see on the next slide there is our responding census count. So if you were trying to count the population, and that was your only aim for the census, then you'd be better off just starting with the administrative data. But of course, we do a lot more with the census than count the population. So similarly, on the housing snapshot side, we have a scoping process. The address register's already, it's released at a quarterly frequency, so it's already somewhat scoped, but we do need to remove addresses from it that don't represent houses on a housing snapshot. So I've just got the next slide here. It shows that the rules that we use to get from a large list of addresses on our address register down to what we think is representative of addresses that indicate the dwelling stock in Australia. So the biggest set that we remove is that red portion there, non-residential dwellings. It's about 3.3 million. Next, there's a small number of addresses in green there that we regard as non-private. And finally, there's that purple section there where we believe those addresses to be of somewhat dubious quality, and we remove those. And just as a high level outcome here at the national level, here we have on the left the count of the population snapshot compared to our official census-based count once we've adjusted that for non-response, and they're very, very close. The population snapshot is only 0.2% higher. On the right, we have a similar comparison with the dwelling stock compared to the housing snapshot, and that's a bit higher, 0.8%, but it's sort of still within that magical 1% number, so very close. Things get a little bit murkier when you go down to a smaller area level. So here we're looking at the distribution of differences across areas in Australia, where an area has about 10,000 people in it. You can see that most of those counts are within plus and minus 4% for population counts, with a distribution that's slightly skewed to the right. On the housing side, the distribution's more centred. The counts are actually closer. They're within plus and minus 3%. But of course, there are some outlying areas where we have actually more over coverage. You can see there's a fat tail going out to the right there. So if we have a problem of under or over coverage with our address register and representing dwelling stock, it's tending toward an over coverage at this stage. Next, I'll just really quickly talk about our method for assigning people to houses. And this is it's a very simple method at this stage. We're simply using people who have the same address at that point in time. They're considered to be in the household, same household. But we make sure that no household has more than 8 people, and this aligns fairly closely to with rules for the census. We make sure there's at least one adult or one person aged over 15. Private dwellings only, and so that ends up excluding quite a lot of people on the person snapshot. There's about 9% of persons that don't have a private dwelling address, They may live, in a hospital or hotel or something like that, but there's a large number of people that can't be put into a private dwelling, and they will end up being put just in an area, floating in an area rather than a house at this stage. And when we do that, we get a very, very slightly higher household size than the census, just 2.6 persons per household instead of 2.5. But like I said, this is a very rough method for now. We are, ABS is working on creating some family relationship indicators using these data sources. And when we have better indicators of parent-child relationships and spouse relationships, we'll be much more able to assign appropriate household groupings. So before I go into the vacancy spotlight, just to show the types of things that we released on that, in addition to dwelling activity, we released some new household equivalent income statistics and also electricity consumption. And we're looking at a range of other things that we could release in the context of the next census. Once you create snapshots, like the census, they really lend themselves to maps. So if you go on the website, you'll see that we have some very nice colourful maps that represent this data. So let's now have a spotlight on this new dwelling activity type statistic. And in Australia, there's a lot in the news about a housing crisis. There's definitely a squeeze in Australia compared to pre-COVID times. The number of available houses to the number of people wanting a house is definitely tightening. And yeah, this new snapshot was used in a recent ABC News article. So firstly, the census doesn't collect the data that's needed to inform around this. What the census measures is unoccupancy, and there's often a common confusion around that. There's about 10% of houses that are not occupied on census night, and that's often immediately confused with a vacancy rate, and people say, wow, there's 10% of houses sitting vacant. What's this about a housing crisis? But of course, there's lots of reasons a house won't be occupied on census night, but it's not necessarily vacant. So we've attempted to create two vacancy measures. The first one based on electricity consumption, and we add that data for sort of a 1 to 3 month period around the census. So any dwelling that has zero consumption over that time. And the second measure was based on dwellings that are considered inactive in those government sources. So that someone has indicated that they no longer live at a particular address, and that address has not been reopened in any other government administrative data source. So let's see how they compare. So the green on the left there is just the number of houses on the snapshot, 10.8 million. We define this rate over the number of houses that we actually have electricity data for. And so that was 8.4 million houses. And then of those, 107,000 houses had zero consumption. And that works out to be about 1.3% of those houses. And that is much more in the ballpark of what people are expecting when they think of a vacancy rate. And amazingly, we got exactly the same vacancy rate nationally using this other method of government person level data. So we have the same number of houses on the snapshot on the left there, 10.8 million. And we're measuring this measure over the number of houses that have appeared as an address anywhere in the government data sources over the last 5 years. So it's about 10.1 million. And of those, 136,000 have been closed off as an address and not reopened anywhere. And so, yeah, it seems quite amazing that we got this same national vacancy rate of 1.3%. But we believe they are actually quite different. It could be a bit of a fluke. So the electricity data we think is much more reflective of a point in time, because it's only measured over this 1 to 3 months, whereas the government data is constantly being updated over time, and we think that reflects a longer term average. And when you go down to look at some of the differences at a small area level, you can see they are actually often very different. These rates were actually measured during the time that Australia was experiencing lockdowns with COVID. And so we see that the electricity data often aligned more with what you'd expect was happening exactly around that time, such as people going home to live in the rural areas. So the vacancy rate was lower there using electricity data compared with the government data. But an issue for us at the moment is that we only have this electricity data as a one-off at the time of the census, whereas we have the government data coming in on a regular basis. So what we've done since that initial release is to create a time series using this new measure, the second type of inactivity measure, looking from 2016 to 2023. And COVID was right in the middle of that, so it's an interesting time to be looking at that series. What you can see there in red is the increasing dwelling stock, or a number of active addresses implied over that time. And you can see it flattening out just in recent years, and this aligns with what seems to be a slowing in housing growth in Australia. And at the same time, we have this inactivity measure. So the green line there, the number of houses that would be considered inactive, is declining quite sharply from around COVID onwards. And if you calculate on the right there, you calculate the inactivity rate using that, you can see it was quite flat at 2% up until COVID, and then has dropped really quite steeply since then, down to about 1.4. So just to close up, I'll show you a couple of maps. As I said, this data lends itself very well to maps. This is the Sydney region in Australia, and yeah, there's quite dense housing growth where you can see all those, dense housing where you can see all those circles, and Sydney's expanding out to the left there. So you can, the blue shading in the background indicates growth in housing, and you can see where it's darker blue, there was higher growth, and then you can see there was higher growth in the years leading up to COVID, whereas on the right, that there's less deep blue in the background. The colour of the circles indicate the number of inactive dwellings. So again, in the lead up to COVID, purple means that there was an increase in the number of inactive dwellings, or dwellings potentially vacant. Whereas orange indicates that number has gone down. So you can see almost in all areas, the number of inactive or vacant dwellings has gone down since COVID. Where it's darker, that means that it's gone down even more. And this very much aligns with what Australia's reporting in the media and experiencing as a so-called housing crisis. And just very lastly, this is showing just around where the ABS office is in Australia, in Canberra. Here we have a lot of high-rise going up just in the last 6 years. Belconnen, you can see that blue square in the middle. Here is the numbers for Belconnen. If you look at that column on the left there, you can see that number of houses going up quite steeply in the lead up to COVID, and continuing to go up quite steeply since COVID. And in the lead up to COVID, the number of inactive dwellings was also rising, just in line with the increasing number of high rise going up. But you can see just in the last few years that that number of available units is dropped quite sharply. So we had a vacancy rate sort of around 4%, if you like, before COVID, and now it's just around 1.2% using this measure. So that's pretty much brought us to the end of this presentation, just to indicate that we are continuing this research alongside our support of the census, which is our main program. But some of the questions we're considering is, how long do you define that time window over which a dwelling is your dwelling stock in government data? And the longer you make that window, the more we've realised you potentially pick up what we might think of as derelict houses. So houses that have been sitting there for a long, long time and not being used by anyone. And yeah, also rethinking this idea of vacancy versus a utilisation of a dwelling over a time period, because once you're starting to look across time, vacancy is not necessarily a very useful sort of concept, where you may, for example, have an area that has higher vacancy that measured at a point in time, but has also a higher utilisation of those dwellings over that time period. So that closes my presentation. I'm very happy to take any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ross, and really great to see the use of alternative data sources to compile some of these estimates. So Ross, I think there's at least one question in the chat that you might want to have a look at if you've got time, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end, but thank you. So we're going to move on to our second presenter. So this is Brahim Burham, and Brahim is the Chief Canadian Housing Statistics Program at Statistics Canada. And he's going to give us a presentation about developing housing statistics using innovative approaches, applied work from Statistics Canada. So Brahim, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jackie. Can you all see my screen? Good? Perfect. So let's jump directly into the topic. So a few elements of context. This has been discussed right before. It is very clear that housing is not just a simple commodity, but it's way more than that. And it's really the place where individual needs interact with broader economic, social, and environmental factors. And therefore, our way of approaching and talking about housing is changing, and so is the way that we see housing data. And today, in order to see housing as a system rather than part of other frameworks, it's important to have more data, more detailed data, and more data integration. So in this presentation, I will show you a few examples of innovative approaches that have been developed at Statistics Canada to create new statistics on housing using administrative data, satellite imaging, and so on. And I will, at the end, discuss the lessons learned and challenges that you can face. First, initiatives that I would like to discuss with you today. So at Statistics Canada, we developed a new program in 2017, which is called the Canadian Housing Statistics Program, with the goal of building a repository of all residential properties in Canada. That was the objective. And in order to do so, the program that I will call the CHSP uses administrative data. So I think you are all familiar with the notion of administrative data, but basically this means that we use data that are collected by organizations which are not statistical agencies, and these data are collected not for statistical purposes. And in the context of the CHSP, what we use is that we use land registries and municipal property tax assessments. So if you want to own, you pay taxes on your property based on these characteristics, and this is exactly what we are using. The one specificity in the Canadian context is that those data, those files, are collected, are managed by different types of organizations. Sometimes they are managed at the provincial territorial level. Sometimes it's by municipalities. Sometimes it's by group of municipalities. Sometimes it's public. Sometimes it's private. Sometimes it's in between. So highly complex. And so in the CHSP, we managed to collect all that information. So we have agreements and partnerships with many data providers. And we were able to collect that information, harmonize it in order to create this repository that includes almost all residential properties in Canada, with a few exceptions. In this repository of properties, we have also all the characteristics of the residential properties, such as their type, their size, their value, and so on. And an important feature of the program is that we have all the properties, but we are also able to link the information about the properties and their owners with other administrative data, such as tax information, immigration data, business information on business from the business register. So at the same time that we built this repository with this database with all residential properties, we have also another database with all owners of residential properties and the characteristics of these owners, such as their demographic information, their age, their sex, their income, their immigrant status, and so on. Okay. And in terms of results, today the CHSP is now able to publish annual information on the characteristics of residential properties in Canada and the characteristics of their owners. And it's really through the work of data integration, this ability to link many different types of administrative files, that we're able to create value, to create new statistics on housing on different topics. For instance, as I said, the demographic characteristics of the owners, were able to publish annual statistics on properties that are owned by non-residents of Canada, so people who do not have any connections to Canada apart from their ownership of their properties, information on investors, information on investment properties, and so on. On top of this, an interesting feature of the database that are created by this program is the fact that they can be linked to other data sets in order to derive new insights to provide new results. Last year, we linked the CHSP data with the historical tax filings, and we were able to look at the relationship between parents and children in the housing markets. So for instance, we answered a very simple question, such as, are you more likely to become an homeowner in your 20s and early 30s if your parents are also homeowners? What's the nature of the relationship? What is the impact on the value of the properties that you own? And so you can see with these topics that it's really about the transmission of housing wealth, the transmission of and the perpetuation of inequalities, difficulties to access the homeownership market for some younger Canadians. So quite interesting topics. And these days, we have also work in progress where we link the CHSP database with information, geospatial information on flood risk. And the objective is to get better information about the exposure of housing and some owners to floods. So really the topic of vulnerability to this shock. The second types of initiatives that I wanted to discuss today is about how can we derive new attributes at the structural level. So for instance, information about buildings, physical infrastructures, and the characteristics of those buildings. This information is critical in some contexts, especially, I would say, when it comes to design housing policies. However, this information may not exist in all municipalities or in certain areas, and even if it exists, sometimes there might be some limitations, for instance, in terms of availability or in terms of the format of the data. So there are a few examples here of initiatives that try to derive the attributes of the physical buildings using innovative approaches. The first two examples that you will see here are quite related. They use deep learning, and also they use imagery in order to derive these attributes. So the first example that you have here, and you have a link included if you want to see more details, especially in terms of more technical details, I would say. I will remain very high level today. So they use deep learning and street level imagery in order to derive new attributes about the buildings, especially their type. So the objective was to train a model in order to classify the different types of buildings and be able to say, well, is it a house? Is it an office building? Is it an apartment tower? Is it an industrial building? Is it a church or anything else? And they were able to train the model in order to improve the accuracy of the model. In the second bullet point that you have here, it's more or less the same idea. So instead of looking at being in front of the building, well, you are at the top of that building. So they use satellite imagery, and the objective was to determine if it was possible to identify new construction start. Okay, so you have a green space, and 1 year later you have something that's being built. So can you use that information and can you extract it systematically, I would say. So there was really more a proof of concept, I would say. And last item that you have here on the slide, and again, you have a link. So it's a database that you can download if you're interested. We have a team at Statistics Canada that developed a new tool. So they use geolocalized business data, and they were able to create and to publish block level information on proximity to services. So you have an example at the right with the map. You can see the city of Toronto. Again, you have the block. Each block is very small. It's the smallest units of analysis in the census. And for each block, you can evaluate the proximity to a bunch of services, such as groceries, pharmacies, schools, public transport, and so on. So quite interesting. And again, you can download the data set and you can combine it. I mean, you can merge it with other data sets depending on your needs. So quite interesting. Let me take a look at my time. Okay, perfect. Last examples examples of applied work that are being developed in the agency these days. A few examples of a project that will use administrative data, but I would say, you know, the perfect example of administrative data is with tax data, as I mentioned for the CHSP. But here, those are more conventional types of data for these examples. So the first one is using web ads on rents and available dwellings. If you are an owner and you want to rent your flat, well, you put it online. So we are trying to see if we can get that information to create new statistics on the rent that is asked. Quite interesting in the sense that if you are a newcomer, if you are someone that is looking for a new apartment, the rent that is being asked is not the same that the rent that people pay when they stay in their house. So to really capture this difference. And the three additional projects, quite interesting, trying to use tribunal data on evictions. The third one trying to use data from shelters to identify, to get a better sense of the residents of homeless shelters. And for the last one, we have the objective to draw a portrait of residents in social housing and those who receive benefits from federal housing programs. You can see with the last examples that we are talking about evictions, homelessness. Those are topics that are really critical related to housing, obviously, but it's very difficult to get information about this phenomena. It's really difficult to know exactly the trajectories of people, you know, in and out homelessness, who are the most vulnerable people to these shocks. And here, what we are trying to do with this approach is trying to use administrative data or data that already exists to extract some information about this phenomena. So quite interesting in terms of approaches. Let me. Yeah. Sorry, okay, perfect. A few words about the benefits, and then I will talk about the lessons learned. So the benefits, I think, for all these different initiatives, I already presented some of the benefits. Like, I think there is really a lot of opportunities thanks to this availability of administrative data or new techniques and this ability to combine different data sets. So in terms of general goals, well, the objective is, you know, either to complement more traditional approaches or to use that instead of traditional survey approaches, in the sense that some populations may be difficult to capture. There might be some limitations with existing more traditional survey approaches, and therefore the use of administrative or alternative data can be a good substitute or complement to these approaches. Second objective, second benefit, well, overcoming limitations of traditional survey methods, sampling for rare events. I talked about homelessness, I talked about evictions. It could be quite complicated to reach out to these populations. Longitudinal design, which is something that is key. To give you an example, as I talked about tax information, well, most people pay taxes every year, so most people fill taxes every year, and therefore you have the information about people's income every year, and so it's quite natural to be able to use that information to monitor the evolution of the housing market and the situation of people in this market. And an advantage if you use administrative data is that you reduce the response burden that you put on the population, and it may circumvent the issue of decreasing response rate. Quite obvious, increasing coverage. I talked at the beginning about the CHSP, this ability to build a repository of all properties. It's something that would be very difficult to do otherwise, frequency, granularity, and so on. About a few lessons learned. First, something that is really key, I believe, is the commitment to openness and transparency when it comes to using administrative data. As I said at the beginning, administrative data are not collected initially for statistical purposes. They have other objectives. And therefore, this idea that you have a national statistical agency that collects that information, that combine it with other sources of information, other types of data, is something that could raise questions in the population, and those are very fair questions. And therefore, it's really important to communicate about the benefits of why we are doing it, with what type of information, what's the final purpose, what's the objective of it, and Statistics Canada have a very strict rules in place in order to inform the public about these goals. Similarly, we are in administrative data, you are using data about people. So it's really necessary to have very strict measures in place to protect the confidentiality of the data, to make sure that you cannot never identify a specific individual or specific business. And those are topics that are really key when we start combining data sets and collecting information from other organizations. I've included several links here. If you are interested in this topic, I really invite you to take a look. Last words here again about the lessons learned and challenges. The role of partnerships and collaborations is something that we learn as being key. It's fundamental. Again, as I said at the beginning, with the CHSP, with different types of data collected from different organizations everywhere in the country, well, this work of collecting that information is something that is really costly. It takes a lot of time, but it requires a lot of collaborations with other stakeholders. So this idea of collaboration and building partnerships is something that is key. For the first program that I presented at the beginning, we have more than 25 different data providers just to get that, the raw data that we need after that to transform and work with. There are some risks related to the acquisition of private data. It's clear. There might be a cost. Sometimes it could be very costly. And there might be some quality issues. Again, as I said several times, it's because administrative data are not collected for statistical purposes. And therefore, the quality of the data in order to be used by a statistical program is something that could be challenging. And therefore, there is a risk of project failure, which is particularly important in those contexts. Complexity, the lack of standards. It's quite, just to give you an example, again, in the beginning, I talked about land registries and property assessment and so on. The definition of an apartment, something as simple as an apartment, may be different from one location to the other because it's not taxed the same way in one municipality to the other. So just this work of harmonizing the different concepts, making sure that it is accurate, making sure that we talk exactly about the same thing and what we have in mind is something that requires a lot of time, a lot of efforts, and you need to have subject matter experts to work on this, making sure that everything makes sense. Lengthy process involved in integrating all this data from multiple sources. I said, at the beginning, well, we have all these properties and we link with tax, we link with immigration data. Well, this looks very simple, but actually it's not. So we need to have many experts involved, especially in terms of technicality. It is highly complex. So there is a lot of work needed, and it takes time. You need to build the infrastructure, and you need to build the expertise and the knowledge on this. And last word, 10 seconds, that's perfect in terms of timing. It's really key as a national statistical agency to think about, the data that you will create with your administrative information or innovative approaches, like, can you say that those are actually official statistics? Can we publish those as official statistics? So to answer that question, you really need to think about how representative your data are. When you collect information from different data providers or using innovative approaches, you may end up in a situation where there are missing parts. A region is missing, a municipality is missing because the information is not available. So how do you work with that? How do you communicate about this? And it's, at the end, you need to think about how can you translate the statistics that you have built into a national and official statistics. At the end of the presentation, you have a bunch of links if you're interested in our product. And I think that's it for me. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brahim. That was really interesting, thinking about all the different data you're showcasing to us, but also I think some really interesting questions that you've raised as well around and I think kind of linked with Ros around kind of concepts and standards that we might need to be thinking about, and some of the challenges around whether these should be classified as official statistics. So thank you very much. I would encourage people again, if you've got questions, to put it in the chat, and if the presenters could respond to those questions, that would be fantastic. We're going to move on to our next presenter. So I would like to introduce Annabelle Murugan. Hopefully I've said that correctly, Annabelle. Annabelle's the head of Trade and Productivity Division at OECD, and she's going to give us a presentation on opportunities and challenges for house price statistics. So I will hand over to you now, Annabelle.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. I'm really delighted to be addressing you today. My presentation is really different from the two very interesting presentations we've had so far, because I'm really going to talk about house prices from a user point of view, not from a producer point of view, and I will also have a more cross-country approach. So my talk today is going to be to rely essentially on some work that was done by the OECD and was led by the economics department. And one key outcome of this work was that housing is really a multifaceted area where evidence-based analysis really require a number of indicators, both on the outcomes and also on the instruments. And in particular, in this work, we identified a few data gaps. In particular, those data gaps are related to house prices, access, vulnerability in access to housing, and local land use regulations. So what I'm going to do today is to focus only on one aspect, the house price aspect, because this is really an area where we have a lot of demand from a lot of different users, and there's still some very important data gaps. So what I'm going to do today is first to talk a little bit about the different uses of house prices, and then I will move on to review the different gaps that exist at the national level, but essentially at the regional and the city levels. Then I will talk a little bit about the need also to develop some measure of house price levels as opposed to growth. And finally, I will say a few words about the necessity to improve the timeliness of the data before I conclude. So let's start with the different uses of house prices. House prices are in fact a very interesting indicator because they can be used for a lot of different usages. At the microeconomic level, they affect economic consumer behavior. They can influence the decision to buy the house or to sell a house. This is the supply side, but they can also have an impact on the decision to become homeowner, and this is the demand side. At the macro level, house prices are closely monitored because they can be seen as an indicator of consumption and in terms of economic growth. Indeed, they are an input when you want to estimate the value of housing, which is often the largest assets or the largest liability of a household. And we often look at those data to monitor households' borrowing capacity and debt burden, and then their effect on consumption and then on economic growth. But house prices also have an impact on residential mobility, which affect the job matching process and provide channels through which housing affects economic performance and resilience to shock. And finally, house prices can also be seen as a financial stability or a soundness indicator to measure risk exposure. If you go now beyond the economy, house prices also affect environmental and social outcomes through multiple channels, and they are, for instance, interrelated with issues such as inequality or decarbonization. So you can see that there's a lot of different uses for house prices, and this has an important consequence because potentially there are very different users of these statistics. And this means that there could be very different views on the preferred coverage of the index or on the preferred methodology applied for its construction. So international standards have been developed over the past few years for the compilation of house price statistics, in particular since the financial crisis. The idea was to try to get some comparable data, to get some early indicators of imbalances, to be able to detect those imbalances at an earlier stage. And this has led in 2009 to the Data Gap Initiative and the development of international standards for statistics and to help the compilation of comparable house price indices. So at the OECD, we collect house price statistics at the national and the regional level on a quarterly basis, and we release this data online. We also have the OECD house price trackers that you can see a snapshot here, which is a neat visualization tool where you can display different indicators of related to housing. So you can pick the country or you can pick the indicator and visualize what's happening on labor markets. However, this tool really relies on data that are provided by NSOs. So at the moment, it is far from giving a complete picture. And the main point I would like to make today is that we still have a lot of data gaps to fill in if we want to have a comprehensive picture in terms of house price of house prices. So in this table, what you can see are the data availability of house price indices for OECD countries by dwelling types and by vintages. So the numbers in the tables represent the number of countries which publish some data. And you should compare those numbers to 37, which is the number of countries we have covered in the analysis. So you can see that there is at least one house price index, which is compiled according to international statistical standards and which cover the country as a whole for each of the 37 countries that we covered. However, only 31 economy compiled national level indices that are representative for all dwelling types and all vintages at the same time. So the recommendation here would be to extend the coverage of house price indices as much as possible to cover all dwelling types and all vintages. This will improve the comparability across country. Where you move on and look at the subnational level now, the coverage has been expanding but still remains limited. You have only 29 countries which compile at least one house price index at the subnational level, and 16 of them provide subnational indices that are covering all dwelling types and vintages together. However, for some of those countries, the time series that you have is really, really short. In addition, there is a lot of scope to improve the comparability of subnational house prices across countries. At the regional level, the existing statistics usually follow the administrative regions within countries, and usually it's not difficult to map this data with other classifications, such as the Eurostat classification or the OECD classification. However, at the city level, country practices are not standardized in terms of delineation of cities. So in this context, it would be really useful to track house price developments within functional urban areas, and in particular to have a distinction between the city and the commuting zone. And this would ensure comparability across countries and would be extremely useful for economic analysis. Just to give you an example of the type of information that we could get if all the countries were doing this type of statistics at the city level. In this chart here, you have in red the house price for London, and in blue the house prices for the rest of the UK. So you can see that the evolution of house prices in London have been pretty stable compared to the rest of the UK before the pandemic. If you now move to the period after the pandemic, you can see that the house prices in London have been moving at a much faster rate. It's still slower than the rest of the UK, but still you can really identify a change here. And having some information for other cities in other countries would be very useful to really get a sense of whether this change that we observe for the UK is country specific or not. Another area where we also need to make a little bit of progress is in terms of measuring house price levels, which typically are not available from official statistics agencies. In fact, the comparison that you should make here is also with consumer price inflation. Basically, you all know CPI.
Sorry, please mute your mic.
Can I do? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I thought it was my mic or something. Okay, so I was talking about house price levels. So when you think about CPI gives you an information of consumer price indexes over time. But when you really want to get to compare price levels across space, you need to have another concept, which is purchasing power parities. So here, it's the same type of idea. You really need to get house price levels to be able to assess barriers to labor mobility and financial challenges that are faced by households living in different areas, in particular in different regions, to provide some signal of regional inequalities. So one way to move forward here would be to have some pilot projects in some countries, which could then be used as a basis for the development of international guidelines to measure regional house price levels. So at the OECD, we've done some work on this issue, and you have a link to the paper here. And we have set up a methodology that has been tested for a few countries, in particular Spain and the UK. And the idea there was to use some econometric techniques to develop regional house price levels that are consistent with economy-wide indices. The approach doesn't require to collect a lot of information, but still it needs to be tested to see if it's really applicable to other countries and if it really fits country needs. But in our view, this would be a good temporary solution to respond to the demand for this type of statistics in the short term at a small cost. And of course, this would be only an empirical statistics. And looking forward, future development of official statistics on house price levels will require collecting a lot of information, but making also some important methodological choices about the methodology to use, about the sources to use. And in this context, what would be extremely useful is to develop some form of international guidelines once we have sufficient country experience to assess what is feasible and what is reliable, so that we can also ensure that countries develop statistics that are comparable across countries. Lastly, let me say a few words about the need to improve the timeliness of house prices. Just house prices indices are lagging by about 2 quarters. So to put things into perspective, if you think about CPI is usually lagging by 1 or 2 months. So this is not a big issue. If you're interested in structural questions such as slow-moving phenomenon, like home ownership and affordability or decarbonization. But this is really important if you're looking at house prices to assess financial stability or to measure risk exposure. There, you really need to have quasi-real-time indicators. So we are facing a trade-off here because we all know that NSOs are facing increasing demand for statistics, but have less resources. And as the previous speaker mentioned, there is also declining response rates. So one way to square the circle would be to provide some types of nowcast by developing models to provide some advanced indicators of house prices, either by developing models or by web scraping information from real estate agencies. Of course, there's no ideal solution here, but if it's done properly, experimental estimates can really provide some useful information that analysts can rely upon. So to conclude, let me just summarize my wish list, as I said, from a user point of view on for house price developments in the future. First, there is a need to extend the coverage of house price indices as much as possible to cover all dwelling types and vintages. Second, there is a need to compile house price indices at subnational levels in terms of international statistical standards, in particular at the city level. Third, it would be really useful to also start developing statistics on house price levels, both at the national and subnational levels. But already at the national level, it would be a big step forward. And finally, there is a demand to explore the development of experimental measure of nowcast, if you like, to get more insights on most recent development in housing market. Let me stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. And I think you've given us some really great things to think about in terms of where we go forward, and also some maybe call to action around house price levels. So thank you. Just to remind everybody, if you've got questions, please put them in the chat. We'll only have, this will be about 5 minutes at the end for discussion. So I'm going to move us promptly on to our fourth presenter. Very much like to introduce Robert Ndouar. Robert is the Chief Data of the Data and Analytics Unit, External Relations, Strategy and Innovation Division at UN Habitat. And Robert's going to give us a presentation entitled Measuring the Right to Adequate Housing Towards a Global Set of Housing Indicators. So Robert, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Let me know if you can see my slides.
We can, yes.
All right, perfect. So I will just give a quick recap of some of the global processes that UN Habitat is currently supporting, particularly on the journey towards developing but also harmonizing housing indicators. And of course, a good starting point here is just to flag up for everyone that we are a continent that is urbanizing very fast, and we see this in terms of the city growth themselves, but also in terms of the volumes that we are seeing around the elements of urbanization. And we know that the future, of course, is very much urban. And of course, a futuristic urban settlement means very much that we need to cater for the infrastructure, which of course involves housing. And we, of course, in parallel, seeing, like everyone has noted in the first three presentations, that when it comes to housing, it's basically a big crisis at the moment. From our own statistics, we see that close to about 2.8 billion people today are affected by housing inadequacy. We have about 1.1 billion people who live in slums and informal settlements. But we're also seeing that number growing more and more. In the last 20 years alone, we've almost added 165 million people onto the numbers that are living in slums and informal settlements. And obviously, on the side of homelessness, we're also seeing an expanding and growing number of people experiencing homelessness, which is up to about 318 million. And obviously, this is an aspect that has been picked up across the board, particularly by many news media outlets. And they echo, of course, the message that we are very much in a crisis of housing, but sometimes this is very much visible in the form of homelessness. But in other settings, of course, we see this in the growing number of people living and experiencing, for example, slum life or informal settlements life. But that sort of crisis, of course, is something that alarmingly we've also seen over the years. And this is very well documented in quite a number of resolutions, but also many global agendas. Going back, of course, to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there we see that housing was already recognized as part of the right to an adequate standard of living. In the first Habitat Conference in 1976 in Vancouver, adequate shelter and provision of services related to that was also recognized by many governments. And you see that repeating in the 1996 Habitat 2 conference in Istanbul. And of course, quite a number of GA resolutions have also come through, again, highlighting perhaps the connection between housing and poverty, or even the lack of housing and integrated housing policies, but also the elements on social protection. But also lately, we see that, for example, in the 2016 New Urban Agenda in Quito in Ecuador, there was a very strong commitment, again, from countries to make sure that they do more around the crisis we are seeing today on housing, particularly by bringing in coherence around housing policies, but at the same time also facilitating implementation and financing adequately those many policies. And of course, the very latest one here is the 2022 Human Rights Commission resolution, which again emphasized very much going back perhaps to the 1948 one, but re-echoing this, particularly around the work we need to do with the New Urban Agenda, but also the 2030 Agenda, in ensuring that we bring a little bit of greener hope when it comes to achieving and getting the right to human rights on adequate housing on track. So of course, this all excellently was packaged in the 2023 UN Habitat, United Nations Habitat Assembly that was in Nairobi, re-echoing all those many resolutions and previous commitments. Member states at that time, in June 2023, agreed that one, we needed as a global community working with many stakeholders, first to assess the state of the efforts that has gone through in terms of realizing the adequate housing for all, but at the same time tasked many stakeholders, including UN Habitat, to work towards identifying some bit of policies that have worked, but also best practices that have brought at least a shift of the need around the realization of the right to adequate housing. And most of all, they also pushed for the idea of working towards a framework for measuring and reporting on the right to adequate housing. And here there was a strong emphasis in ensuring that this reflects the diverse national, but also local contexts that we are dealing with today, given that, urbanization is happening in many ways, and sometimes it's at very different levels of transitions across the board. But they also noted that we needed to consider what sort of progress had been made, where and how, and perhaps package this into a useful and well-informed work plan that everyone can then contribute to address the current housing crisis that we are all experiencing. There was also a very strong emphasis on the need to ensure that this sort of cooperation is developed bilaterally where it's possible, but also integrating in some sort of multilateral aspects of collaboration around the housing policies, but also programs and developing innovative projects. And most of all, they tasked the UN Habitat and other stakeholders to take back a report at its third session where this entire progress needs to be reshared for them to make the additional decisions around that. So this history, of course, is important for us to reflect on and build a strong case, knowing that many years ago, this has been a crisis and it still remains a crisis. So sometimes this, of course, is a very persistent problem, but we do believe that working together and working with everyone, we should be able to at least shift the needle around the right to adequate housing. So from UN Habitat and many other partners, what we've been trying to do, particularly reflecting on the recent Habitat resolution that came in 2023, is to begin to work towards the aspect of the measurements, basically some sort of early work around these measurements. And this is what connects very well with what we call a global minimum core set of housing indicators. And there was a history in the past that UN Habitat earlier on worked on a core set of housing indicators, but this, of course, was evolved into the MDGs. Some of it also evolved into the SDGs, but a few other aspects of the right to adequate housing were not necessarily taken on board in those additional frameworks. And of course, today, when we talk of the right to adequate housing, we do refer to mainly the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and in dignity. And there are 7 elements that need to be considered as part of the right to adequate housing. Specifically here, security of tenure, the access and availability to services or materials or facilities and infrastructure, the element of affordability, as we've also just heard from the previous speaker around the housing price issue, but also the habitability. In other words, housing should be a place that guarantees physical safety, provides adequate space and protection from many other environmental and structural hazards, but at the same time, accessibility. So it shouldn't be in a place that is very disadvantaged, or perhaps leaving out a few marginalized groups, as well as location. And then last but not least, the element of cultural adequacy also becomes very important, particularly here, of course, bringing in the fact that cultural identity sometimes also tied to the housing, but also we see some elements of sustainability in how we build our housing being very much also connected to the cultural component. So these are the 7 elements that UN Habitat has been working with. We've tried to develop a couple of indicators that are aligned with these 7 elements, and these are currently available in initial drafts, hoping again to interact with a lot of partners to make sure that we refine these indicators in a way that becomes almost universal applicable, but also contextually applicable in different cities and settings. So today, of course, this minimum set has been developed through certain principles, and some of the guiding considerations here was to make sure that, one, they are very much aligned with what already exists in form of SDGs, in the form of the New Urban Agenda, but also the global urban monitoring framework processes. And then we've also tried to make sure that this is very much harmonized with a lot of existing frameworks and standards and other methodologies, particularly what cities and national partners are already working with, but more so even the regional contextual and national and city level contextual issues. There was also the consideration around the aspect that housing is not just a standalone issue, it's very much intersectional. So the idea, of course, considering the housing continuum and the inclusion of other components, for example, homelessness was also carried forward. And then there was also the need to make sure that the way we measure needs to connect to a lot of the housing policies. Of course, one of the key lessons we've learned over the years is that measurement frameworks sometimes come through, but they're never connected to the local housing policies. So that's an idea that we're trying to integrate into the development of these indicators. And of course, on the element of partnerships, what has been core here is to take these proposals to the NSOs and many other stakeholders to make sure that they do understand what we are aiming for, but also how it connects to the already existing frameworks that they do have. And of course, knowing that they need to collect and process a lot of these data sets becomes a little bit core in terms of contextualizing and also making sure that it's locally reliable, but also locally applicable. Then we've been working on the aspect of ensuring these are also innovative. And here, of course, it's the idea of leapfrogging data production and collection, but also processing, but also introducing in other innovative data collection process, for example, through big data analytics or Earth observation, but also bringing on board citizens to support on data collection. And of course, most of all is to make sure that this is packaged so well in a way that it's understandable even to the non-statistical communities. So where we are, of course, in the process is also to make sure that this gets to be aligned with the new urban agenda. And the new urban agenda was very strong on housing, particularly through the entry points of all the 7 elements. And we see this as an example in terms of the security of tenure. It makes strong emphasis around the security of tenure itself in terms of access to that land. And then the housing market context, but also the ownership and rental arrangements, but also the aspects of homelessness. When you look at the aspect of accessibility, which is number 5 here, the new urban agenda, of course, for example, was also very strong in terms of bringing on board an analysis of crisis and emergency situations, particularly people living in emergency accommodation, but also accessibility to people who are usually left behind, particularly people experiencing disabilities. And of course, the list goes on and on, so I won't be able to run through it. But the idea here is that there are quite a number of stronger elaborations in terms of articles in the new urban agenda that have elaborated even better what we can do around housing through all these 7 elements of the right to adequate housing. So in the design of the indicators, we've paid attention to this sort of alignment to at least make sure that we pull through indicators that can support us to at least monitor and report on each of these various aspects. So of course, the early quick checks we've done on terms of the applicability of some of these indicators, we've tried to collect some data, but also look back in time to pull in a few data sets that have been collected and build a picture of what we see and what is emerging. And of course, this replays very much the same message. One, there is a lot of differences in terms of the local context, but also what is being collected in terms of indicators is very much varying from country to country, sometimes even from city to city within the same country. And that's why the element of harmonizing here will be very important when you're looking at some sort of global process and global framework for housing indicators and statistics. But overall, of course, the data itself shows one, overcrowding. We are not only seeing just the housing crisis, but we're also seeing increases in overcrowding across the globe. We're also seeing a lot of those patterns sometimes connecting very much to poor living conditions. We are seeing, of course, an increase, as I noted earlier, in terms of people living in informal settlements more and more simply because they can't afford adequate housing. But we're also seeing, for example, variations in infrastructure improvements in some cities. We see, for example, that analysis from Lagos and Nairobi, where there's rapid urbanization growth, but without parallel infrastructure coming through, including housing, to accommodate those sort of increases in population. So of course, these are just some bit of early lessons, some analysis again coming in from the OECD countries. We see, for example, that housing there affects the well-being of many people, particularly through the cost of living. And I think the previous presenter made that case a very strong one. But what the key word here is that housing crisis and, for example, housing affordability is not just a problem of the global south, it's actually a bigger problem as well in the global north. And we see here that, for example, in Europe, on average, people are spending more than 30% or sometimes more than 40% of their household income on housing needs and requirements. So it's a big issue across the board. When you take a look at the data and statistics we've collected around homelessness, again, you see that this is a huge problem that is playing out in literally all the continents, but we see it even being bigger in Asia and Africa, where these two continents are also experiencing currently the fastest urbanization rates. And these are almost pumping in around 30 to 40% of urban populations experiencing a bit of homelessness. So it's on this context that we've been able to rally quite a number of partners, including many national statistical offices, to rethink what is it that we need to measure, how we need to measure that, and some sort of realignment across all the elements of the right to adequate housing. So where we are today, we've done a lot of consultations with many members, some included in this call today. But the idea, of course, is to go back and recheck what sort of indicators we had, what we have today that is relevant, and then harmonize those to be taken forward. We've done initial consultations also with other private sector, academic institutions, and many other real estate agencies that are helping us ensure that the indicators we develop are very much also useful for their own work. Internally within the UN system, we're also working with many partners, again, to align our own ongoing strategies around housing, including how that connects to the SDGs, the New Urban Agenda, but also how we respond to the UN Habitat resolution, for which we need to go back and report in less than 2 years. At the national level, the plan, of course, is very much to work with the national stakeholders to initiate some sort of data collection at the local level or at the city level, or even at the national level, again, to build and begin to give a picture. Because member states from the open intergovernmental working group, which we expect to host in December this year, are looking forward to seeing what countries themselves are actually willing to offer and do around the housing crisis they are facing within their own countries, but in parallel also inform the measurement framework that will be able to evaluate their own investments and progress. But of course, on the other aspect, particularly at the thematic area, we've organized quite a number of consultations. We are going to continue holding those consultations to make sure that the indicators and the framework that we develop and the platform that will be associated with that is very much reflective of all the efforts that everyone is doing, and it becomes one that will also be equally useful. So this is basically how our work plan looks like, and at the moment we are very much at the stage of testing out some of these indicators, putting in some data points on those indicators, and then being able to demonstrate structures of the metadata that countries can begin to work with in a phase of about 1 year from now. So I'll stop there and hand the floor back over to you, Jacqueline.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was really interesting, and I wasn't aware of all the work that had been done, and I think kind of having you present today with obviously some of the outcomes from the first webinar is really, I think, potentially gives us some huge opportunities as an international community to maybe get more involved. So thank you. We've got maybe 5 minutes to have any questions. I know I've seen lots of questions going on in the chat and people responding, so thank you very much for doing that. Is there any question that somebody would like to ask that they feel is maybe kind of interesting for a wider community of participants in this meeting to be involved in? Okay, well, hopefully that means that the chat questions and answers are working really well. So I encourage you to carry on using the chat for that purposes. And I'm going to now, oh yeah, sorry, Benson's just reminding us, if somebody does have a question, raise your hand. So I give you 30 seconds in case somebody does have something they would like to ask. Okay. All right, we'll move on then to the panel discussion. So I'm going to hand over to John Oku now. He's going to introduce the panel discussion and also moderate it. So John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Before I start, it was remiss of me before just I wanted to first of all acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on today. Here in Australia. I am meeting on the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people in Meanjin, which is Brisbane, the traditional name for Brisbane. I just wanted to do a quick acknowledgement of elders past, present and emerging. And also just to acknowledge any members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community that are joining us here. But also, given that this is a worldwide event, we'll also have traditional owners and Indigenous peoples at this event as well. So to acknowledge all those people who are here with us today. So the panel discussion now, what we've got is what we've headed this as is that it's to talk a little bit about data integration as a foundation for developing a housing framework. So we've heard some really interesting case studies from around the world. And I think that in terms of using innovative approaches to thinking about housing statistics, and I think what we wanted to do in the panel discussion was to maybe explore both, I guess, how we sort of see a framework could sit within this rapidly changing environment. I think just as we've had through the presentations, we're very fortunate in the panel to have representation from both the producers as well as the consumers and users of housing statistics. So I might just introduce each of the panel members now briefly. So the first panel member I was going to introduce was Andrew Heiss. Andrew is the Director for the Centre for Income and Socioeconomic Wellbeing Statistics at Statistics Canada. I just wanted to check, Andrew, that you're here.
I am.
Great. Sorry, your camera's not coming up in my view just yet, but I'm glad to hear that you're here. I'll just introduce each of the panel members first, and then we'll go through to I might sort of ask an introductory question for everyone. The second panel member is Robert Ndiritu, who's the Director of the Production Statistics at the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. Robert, I just want to check that you're here also on the call.
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening.
Great. Great to see you, Robert. Thank you. And we've also got Robert Ngugwa, who has just recently presented and is the Chief of the Data and Analytics Unit, External Relations Strategy and Innovation Division at UN Habitat. Robert's already given a very great introduction to UN Habitat's role, and also there'll be some things that'll be interesting to sort of tease out from his earlier presentation. So welcome, Robert. And then the final panel member is Chris Vincent, and Chris is the Vice President of Global Relations and Advocacy at Habitat for Humanity. So for those of you who are not aware, Habitat for Humanity is a global non-for-profit housing organisation working in more than 1,300 communities across the United States in more than 70 countries around the world. Habitat for Humanity has a vision for a world where everyone has a decent place to live, which I think is very consistent with a lot of the goals that we've been talking about here. So I'll just check, Chris, that you're on the call here as well.
I'm here. Thanks.
Great, welcome. All right, well, maybe I'll start first with Andrew. So Andrew, I thought it was really, I think through the presentations that we've had both earlier today, as well as in the first sprint, it was really useful to hear, the work that Statistics Canada is doing, both in terms of the framework, as well a framework for housing statistics, but also some of the innovative approaches that you're looking to take. But I was interested to sort of get a bit of a sense from you about if you think there's any sort of key aspects, topics, or issues that might have been overlooked in the discussions about housing frameworks as we start to think about integrating data. One of the things that comes to mind for me, for example, and it was alluded to in Ross's earlier presentation, is sometimes around two things. One is around the concepts that underlie some of our housing statistics as we start thinking about innovative approaches. Understanding how they relate to the concepts that we have can be a challenge. And then the second thing is around data availability. And also, thinking about the governance around some of those data, actually obtaining some of those data sets can be tricky. And so be interested, those were just some reflections that I had, but I was just keen to get from your perspective if you had any sort of aspects, topics or issues that you think we might need to think about as we start to put together some information in a primer for future housing statistics.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. That's a really deep and broad question, and one could go on to it for a while. Maybe I'll try to wrap an answer I'll try to wrap an answer up in thinking about the importance of a conceptual framework to all of that, to even answering that question. A conceptual framework can serve a number of different purposes. But one of the purposes that it does is it scopes out the system. It scopes out an entire system and provides, if you will, guidance for future data development and analysis. It starts with the concepts. It starts with the concepts and then goes from there to what the statistical pieces are. And it's really important to recognize that it's probably comparatively rare that a statistical piece that we may have in hand is something that matches the concept exactly. And so the conceptual framework is necessary in this context to understanding what some of the shortcomings of those statistical pieces may be, particularly in the housing environment where we are, it's necessary for us to use things like Brahim described earlier today in terms of administrative data, which were created for a different purpose than what we might be applying them to. And so seldom do they line up with our concept. We had some discussion today about housing prices and how housing prices can relate to a number of different concepts. It can relate to offer prices. It can relate to what people's perceived value of their homes are. There's a number of different kinds of Statistics Canada as an NSO produces and picks up a number of different kinds of housing prices that are relevant to people. And a conceptual framework can really help us to sort all of that out. So it really boils down to sort of mapping those relationships between the concepts and the statistics that we may have. Thinking about the obtaining data sets and the governance around that. As an NSO, I think it's important to find that happy, modest ground between obtaining data sets when you need to, but also forming partnerships with other data providers, recognizing that the value and the importance of what they do also. From the public's perspective, they probably don't need to care that much as long as the data is being produced in an unbiased and responsible fashion, whether it's coming from an NSO or whether it's coming from a real estate organization or whether it's coming from a financial institution. The important point about it is that it's being created. Okay, and often in those situations, data cannot be integrated and it cannot be linked, and that's why it's again so important to have a conceptual framework. It allows you to relate these pieces of information without actually linking them together in real time. So I hope that's enough to get the conversation started. I'll pause there because I'm sure that the other panelists have interesting things to add.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that idea of having that sort of conceptual framework is really important, and thinking around how how we can or who can relate together and think about integrating that data becomes quite important. I might pass to Robert and Dirtu to add a little bit, I guess, continue on, I guess, from thinking of it from a National Statistics Office perspective. And Robert, I guess I was interested to get your sort of thoughts, sort of building on Andrew's sort of points around how you think National Statistics Office can effectively incorporate some of those emerging data sources. We talked about some of them like administrative records, satellite imagery, but there could also be other things like, say, web scraping and other things, other administrative sources that we haven't sort of discussed, and how we can integrate them into housing statistics. And be keen to sort of to hear perhaps a little bit around sort of your experiences in how that's been happening in Kenya.
Sorry, thank you, Jonathan. And I'm happy to join you this afternoon. And I also appreciate the presentations that have been made previously by the various speakers. And particularly, I would want to pick on what was presented by Statistics Canada on the issue of trying to exploit the emerging data sources. Let me start by first stating that the NSOs must start to appreciate that it is no longer possible to rely on the previous, usual source, because it is actually becoming very expensive, and therefore it is good to leverage on, like the administrative sources, in the sense that, like now, when you look at the tax, data, it is actually something that we can actually use because it offers a wealth of housing data. And actually, these records can provide information on property ownership, as an example. They can also have information on construction activity and housing market dynamics and the like. And again, what I like about that is that there is actually automation almost like in real time. And I'm saying this because in the Kenyan case, we usually collect statistics mainly from the censuses. And like now, the last comprehensive housing survey that we had actually carried out was in 2011-2012. And it is only now in 2023-2024 that we've actually collected now another, data set. So if you look at the span within which, we take before we collect, comprehensive data, then it means that we have to actually, embrace the emerging data sources. And one of the challenges that I would know with the administrative source is the issue of the data privacy. There could be issues of the consistency. We need to think about it, and also the issues of standardization across the various administrative data sources. Now, if I could move to an area like incorporating web, it is actually also something that we need to embrace, in the sense that it offers insights into housing demand. There's the issues of price fluctuations, and also rental market trends. And it is important then for us actually to address the challenges that might come with that, particularly the issues of legal and ethical concerns. It's something that we'll need to focus on, particularly when it comes now to the data scrapping, the issues of maintaining data quality, and also handling the unstructured data. And if I go to maybe the third one, that's the use of the satellite imagery. It is also something that we need currently to embrace, in the sense that it can provide data on housing density, the issues of living conditions and the like. And I believe that if we do this, it is possible for us to get information on housing availability, the issues of infrastructure and the like. The only challenge is that there is issue of technical expertise that is required in order for us to be able to, process this information. And of course, if we are to leverage on these data sources, then we need to think about the conceptual framework that Adu has referred to. It will be important for us to ensure that we actually talk about the issues of the methodologies, the issues of the definitions and the like. Probably maybe I stop there for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert. I think that you've raised some really good points, and I think the overall sort of thrust of embracing the opportunities that are here, I think are really critical. But also, I think the point that you make around in some cases, for some, particularly in some countries, it is, I guess, going to be. We need to go down this path because this will be the way that we are able to cost effectively collect the information in both not just into the future, but that future is really here and now. I think that might probably brings us nicely into Robert and Guwa, who can talk a little bit perhaps in around. We've talked a bit about this sort of conceptual framework, and I think you talked in your talk earlier, Robert, about the frameworks and the the sort of the minimum, the global minimum core set of housing indicators that UN Habitat is working towards. And so I wonder if there's any sort of strategies that we can employ to create a housing framework that sort of, I guess, links together some of those indicators with a broader sort of conceptual framework, but also then sort of thinks about making sure it takes into account some of the things that Robert also talked about in terms of what some of those sort of future data sources might be.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Yeah, I think there are a couple of insights there, and of course, coming in also from the international perspective, our idea is very much first, of course, to set some sort of standards and harmonize across the board some sort of methodologies that everyone can apply very much consistently. So that's of course the next natural course that we see coming through to support countries. But at the same time, we know that there are many best practices out there coming in from countries, and that's why we're also involved in that process of collecting all the good practices from many countries, and perhaps be able again to connect countries with other countries to make sure that knowledge sharing comes through, so that not everyone has to reinvent each and every piece when it comes to facilitating the application of those sort of housing measurement framework. And obviously, there's also the component of technology transfer that is also very key. I think as Robert Nderitu from Kenya noted, we see a lot of innovative technologies coming in now, and as an international community, you have that sort of bird's view of what is happening in country A and country B, and that sort of idea of mapping out useful technologies. For example, just even identify and counting buildings within cities can be a good starting point for one to know the housing stock they have or the total infrastructure stock they have, and what share of that is for housing per se vis-a-vis population, population within those cities. So these sort of comparables that we want to look at, but also pull in a lot of best practices coming in from countries, and then be able again to test out. And that's why we are looking forward to working with many countries to test out these minimum core set of housing indicators we've developed, to see to what extent is it applicable at national, at subnational, but also within the region, and what sort of variations are coming through to make sure that that standard and the normative consistency in terms of methodology application is very thorough and also very much applicable. But at the same time, we do appreciate that as an international community, and of course working directly with countries, housing is much larger than that. And that is why we believe very strongly in bringing on board also the private sector, so that convening power to bring in the private sector, the convening power to bring in civil society, but also academic institutions in this space will be very valuable for us to make sure that it's an all hands on deck sort of process, to make sure that the entire knowledge out there that can help us improve how we monitor and report and what technology we deploy in monitoring and reporting is all easily accessible to each and every country that needs to apply these sort of systems. So that's how we're trying to harness, not just in development, but also consolidating the different ways and the technologies out there, and also making sure we connect those dots of passing on the technology and knowledge and ideas to those that might not have it, so that it's more or less a shareable sort of process, but also a shareable win-win for everyone. Over.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Robert. I think that idea of, I guess you're going back to the objectives of our sprint here around creating a primer is really around some of the things that you've just said around, particularly around, making the case for having that sort of conceptual framework, but also, that best practice, I think, is really important, and I think it's forums like this that allow us to start to share, as we've done today, innovative approaches that we're using across countries, and to be able to learn from the broader international community. I might bring Chris in here because you also made some points about some of the partnerships that are important, and I think that given Chris's role in Habitat for Humanity, I'd be keen to get his sort of view on how he sees international collaborations and how they can help, whether it's through things like NSOs, other international organisations, civil society, private sector, as you mentioned. How can that sort of help to do things like overcome resource constraints and skill gaps in developing housing statistics? So Chris, keen to sort of get your sort of perspective on sort of how you see the importance of partnerships in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Really appreciate it, and it's great to be on. It's been a terrific set of conversations already. Let me take a quick step back before I get to the partnership piece and just make a couple points and then speak to the partnership piece. But in general, what we find is that especially the populations and the communities in which we're trying to support are underrepresented in global statistics. Especially informal housing, which is 70% of the housing stock globally, and that's a key place that we think needs increased focus and attention in these conversations, and that's. In the West or in more developed countries, the formal market essentially accounts for, you can have most of that data, but it's much more difficult in low and middle income countries to access that information. And we think there needs to be special consideration given that that's 70% of the housing stock. I also think it's important that we need to step back and not assume that people believe that housing is important. While it's a crisis, it may not necessarily be generally accepted that it can have huge impacts on health, education, economic mobility, and we need to make sure that we have good data that is driving that focus and attention for a focus on housing, and not just assume that it's essentially only an affordability issue for certain populations. Which kind of gets me to the housing policy side of things, which is where we focus time and attention. We created a while ago something called the Global Housing Indicators, and I'm happy to share a report in the chat related to that tried to create a framework related to housing policy and study in countries. We did it in 14 different countries and looked at how housing policy impacts are affected, and we think that might be a relevant framework for at least people to look at. It had 5 different pillars and a whole bunch of questions related to each of those pillars to try to drive out, is there good housing policy in this space? But when it comes to partnerships, we think it's critical. There's only so much space and resources that certainly the National Statistics offices have, and there's also times where they have challenges accessing the right information or the right populations. This can especially be acute in emergency situations where local organizations have much better data, and there's plenty of examples on that. But we think in general there needs to be just a broader broader effort because we don't think it can only be done at the government level given the resources. So there needs to be partnerships, there needs to be a coordination, and having common frameworks and common ways of looking at the data would be extremely helpful. So highly supportive of integration efforts when it's possible, and sort of aggregating and collating information and driving common conversations with a broader framework. So with that, I'm going to throw in a few links in the chat, and happy to take any questions at the end related to any of those. But thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'm sure that people would appreciate those links in the chat if you can provide them. So while we're going, if people do have any questions for the panel, please feel free to add them in the chat, and more than happy to talk them through as we go, because I think that we've got a good opportunity to discuss some of the issues that we've been talking about here. I might just go back to Andrew. Andrew, you gave some really helpful sort of starting points around thinking about the conceptual sort of framework and thinking around how that would be a good sort of starting point for how we bring things together. I'm wondering whether given the presentation that that your colleagues have given around actually thinking around how you go from that conceptual framework, think about using innovative approaches, and then sort of how you can then go from it to implement. I'm wondering whether there's been any obstacles that you've had to go from that stage of we've got this nice sort of framework which kind of fits things together. We've got some data sets which potentially could fill some of those, but actually sort of implementing that is always it's always harder, I guess, than it might seem. So I'll just be keen to get your sort of thoughts in terms of some of the practical challenges that you've had from Statistics Canada perspective in that.
So I think that there's the practical challenge between the framework and action is that there's often a very large leap between the aspirational aspects of the framework and the on the ground reality of what data you might have that really describes all of the myriad of linkages that are possible in the framework. So for example, I might be interested in the construction industry and what its ability is to respond to housing supply needs, and I might have a job vacancy survey. I do actually have a job vacancy survey, which can tell me what kind of vacancies I have in the construction industry, like whether they're having a hard time filling their positions. But I don't necessarily have anything that links that to, say, the happiness of homeowners or the ultimate outcomes that we're really, really interested in, the affordability of homes in an area. So either an elaborate linkage strategy needs to be derived whereby, I'm linking things at geographic levels, which means I need to have an extremely powerful data set on both sides of what I'm trying to link, which is often not the case. Or I need to have some other way of relating it through things like the conceptual framework that helps us from the theoretical perspective and allows me to start with a visual, if you will. Statistics Canada has often described it almost as a series of Venn diagrams that overlap, but it allows me to stand up indicators beside one another, and then with the conceptual framework, then I can tell a story that links those two things through the story, not necessarily through the data. And that's a strength and a weakness, right? Like in a perfect world, we'd have data that linked everything to everything, but we don't have that. One could go with complicated modeling exercises, but those are often inaccessible to policymakers, and they're people have a natural suspicion around them because they're complicated and difficult to really understand. So coming back to the statistical framework and the diverse data, that of course is a challenge. I'd like to say one little thing that I should have underscored because it was picked up so well by the speakers after me about how important it is to form partnerships with other organizations. The thing about a conceptual framework that can teach you, all of our brains are only so big. So say I'm the labor guy and I'm thinking about job vacancies in the construction industry. Well, I might not know much about affordability of housing, or I might not know that much about the informal housing market as was described earlier. So the conceptual framework allows everybody to see what the close linkages are among their subjects and enhances communication among experts. So it reminds me as a labor person that it would be a good idea to reach out to the housing people and get some of the social outcomes, for example, that I can relate my results to. It generally speaking leads to a more informed and educated conversation.
Thanks, Andrew. I think your last point about the partnerships is really critical in terms of the framework. Again, if we can make sure that it speaks to multiple communities and to multiple both users, from the user and producer side, it does provide that sort of common language. I think I don't think we should underscore the importance of that as a communication tool, both in terms of making sure that we understand we're on the same page around where when we're talking about different terms and different sort of concepts that we're speaking the same language, but also, as you were just saying earlier, around that the idea that having a type of framework which also is multifaceted does give that ability to tell a story around how does potentially disparate pieces of information from a collection perspective actually tell that sort of broader story, as you pointed out. Robert Ndutu, I just thought I'd pass back to you. I thought you gave some really good points about about some of the technologies in thinking about housing statistics. I was just keen to also get a sense from you about what you sort of see as some of the main obstacles that National Statistics Office face when you're trying to implement some of those new technologies. I think you started to sort of to lay some of those out when you spoke earlier in terms of things like technology, the requirements for skills and technologies and things like that. But I was just keen to get a bit of a sense of what might be some of the obstacles that you've been seeing from your perspective.
Thank you very much. In addition to probably maybe what we had mentioned earlier, there are some key obstacles that I believe we have been facing whenever we try to implement the new technologies. And one of them is actually the issue of data quality and also availability. And in most cases, you'll find that most of the data may be inconsistent, and that there is actually the issue of the NSOs trying to struggle actually to bridge the gaps with the historical data, and especially when it comes down to developing, data within the regions, where maybe the formal records might be scarce. So in this case, that could be a challenge. At the same time, when we look at the issues of the technological infrastructure, you may find that most of the NSOs, and especially from the developing countries, they may actually lack access to advanced technology, or probably the cloud-based platforms that we need for processing the large data sets. And I would imagine that maybe when we talk about international, relations or those collaborations, some of the developed countries would come now out in a day to probably support the developing countries with maybe those technologies. At the same time, when you look at the costs, of actually funding, particularly, coming up probably with the geographical information system, the issues of even looking at the AI, it requires significant, investment in actually software and also skilled personnel. So you might find that within the statistical offices, there are those skills that are lacking. Like now in Kenya, it is now that we are setting up a data science lab, and we actually don't have that adequate capacity. It is now that we are actually developing, that capacity. So there is actually now again the lack of skills, and actually that is also an area that probably we would need probably to look at how we would need to improve on it. Of course, the issue of data privacy and the security concerns is also another major obstacle, given that there are concerns about the privacy and also the protection of personal data. And you'll find that in most countries, they may not have actually, policies that could guard against that. So when we do now like the web scraping, there is now that aspect or that risk of now the data privacy that actually we need to actually address. And of course, the issue of cyber security risks, this can also introduce vulnerabilities, and especially if the NSO is using the cloud-based platforms or integrative sensitive, data sources, that also becomes another issue. But one other obstacle that I would want probably to raise is the issue of the institutional and also the cultural resistance. And I'm raising this because you may find that there are people who, do not want to adopt the new technologies. So generally, at times, people are, they resist change. And therefore, before, people accept that now they can adopt these new technologies, now that actually becomes, another major issue. I don't know whether that would be adequate for now.
No, look, thank you, Robert. That's been really useful. And while you've been talking about some of the aspects from you've mentioned some of them from a developing country, I can certainly say those are real issues from where I sit as well, particularly around managing privacy. Changing systems that were designed to process data in different ways. Those are real challenges that I think sit across all national statistical organisations, and I think that those are real. I think those are real challenges. You also mentioned about the privacy and protection of data, which becomes quite a challenge, given many of us will have legislative requirements to protect information, as well as moral and ethical ones as well. So thank you for your comments there. Robert Ngua, I wanted to just I guess to think a little bit about that idea of that Andrew mentioned about the sort of the common, the framework as a common language. And I was keen to get your sort of perspective, given that you're coming a little bit more from the user side, around how you see the advantage of perhaps having that sort of framework in place to be able to I guess sort of make sure that you're able to talk to those different communities that you mentioned earlier. I think I could see there's some real benefits there, but I was keen to get your sort of perspectives on that.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think for the standardizing of all this framework, it's of course very, very important that one, it's the process of development of that is equally as important as the outcome itself. And the idea there is, of course, when you develop these in silos, or you develop all these frameworks and indicator sets in silos, becomes very difficult at the stage of implementation. So that's why in the process I was describing, it was basically consultation at the stage of development and ensuring you include as many stakeholders as possible. but also making sure that at the stage of training, capacity development, advocacy, familiarization of that sort of framework, but also the practical application brings everyone on board. And at the international level, sometimes that becomes easier to coordinate. But in terms of practical terms in countries, this calls for yet again another process of perhaps bringing in again the different stakeholders, many times different ministries and departments that all contribute to different aspects of housing, and then rallying all those together in terms of what they need to be able to do to implement and facilitate the implementation of that sort of framework. So at the international level, we are probably at a better stage and an easier phase where we've tried to do that sort of process. But of course, many at times that requires taking down to countries, taking it down to cities and local governments, and sometimes even unpacking it in terms of contextual issues and different variations of countries, what it means for the citizens, what it means for a local policymaker, what it means for a parliamentarian before they basically come on board to support you in its own implementation. So it's at that stage that many times, if we've set very good standards and we've also worked with many countries that can also come in and sometimes facilitate the political process that might be difficult in some selected countries, this can make it a little bit easier. We've seen it, for example, in developing other frameworks, which of course the housing indicators framework can also learn from. But many a times these are part of the lessons that definitely need to be taken on board. Politically, we do feel that given the historical nature of all these housing resolutions, as I noted earlier, but also the housing rights documentation and many international instruments, that sort of background gives this idea that in many countries, they do understand the gravity of the challenge and the issue, and they have, the support. And as I noted, housing today can be pieced into many different, sectors. You might see it in terms of the unaffordability of housing, or it might be even just the access to the services that are connected to the housing unit that are missing. But sometimes it might be connected to the prevalence of poverty levels we see. So there are many ways of interpreting it to many policymakers at that ground level. But that needs to be packaged in ways that is easier for them to comprehend, and then easier for them to finance or even prioritize at that local level. But these are engagements that sometimes also come through one-on-one conversations with political leaders at that local level, bringing, of course, the technical explanations of why this is equally important. So that's a journey that we usually need to walk through, sometimes country by country, or sometimes at a very much a regional level. But obviously, as I noted as well, technology is also going to be very handy here, particularly where you have cost implications attached to facilitating the implementation of such a framework. So where we can a bit, leapfrog in terms of technology to cut costs, this will be equally valuable to experiment out. Over.
Thanks, Robert. Chris, I might give you the last word from a panel perspective. I think you kind of highlighted in your sort of your opening remarks about some of the gaps, but keen to sort of see whether there's any opportunities to use like that sort of framework approach to start to get this to some sort of common language to help to sort of identify those gaps, and whether you see some opportunities in that space.
Yeah, I mean, as Robert's noted, we're highly supportive of the resolutions and the supportive kind of implementation of those resolutions from the UN Habitat level and the engagement of countries. And we think there's a lot of initiatives and a lot of ways to kind of pull that together. And that issue of commonality is extremely challenging given how localized housing is, but it is critically important to kind of, I think, help the global community be able to learn more and cross-pollinate. I would mention a couple other things that haven't been mentioned is also that in general, what we see is that official development assistance has really not given much priority to housing or housing policy at all, or housing data. And we think that there is a potential opportunity there where there should be an increased focus and kind of understanding of how important domestic housing markets are, and how do you sort of connect that with what some countries are providing through ODA, and increasing a housing profile in ODA, which we think is extremely underrepresented. Another space that we're really focused on is in the housing microfinance space, and there might be some really interesting ways of data to support innovations in housing microfinance to sort of get lower market finance products out there. We've been doing that through a fund called Microbuild, and we're updating that and creating something called Microbuild 2, where we're trying to provide banks to generate portfolios of housing microfinance. And then lastly, where there's a huge focus is in the climate space, obviously, and there's a lot of resources that will go into the climate space. There is a massive housing focus within climate, but my sense is that there's not a lot of housing people focused on those issues. It's mostly more climate or from the environmental side, and we think that there's a lot of ways that we might be able to connect the dots from the climate and housing space. We're doing that significantly in the U.S. on the implementation of a huge program trying to get to lower emission homes throughout the United States. And we think that there's a huge opportunity related to data that could be helpful for all of those globally. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And certainly that idea of bringing those communities together using that framework makes a lot of sense to me. I just wanted to thank the panel, Andrew, Robert, and Chris. Thank you for your for your insights. I think there's a lot that we can that I think can be helpful that we can get from those in terms of translating those ideas to the primer. And Jackie, I'll pass back to you to close.
Thanks, Jono, and big thanks to all the panel members. So I think we've had a fantastic discussion. Sorry, I've now got somebody trying to come into my hotel room. We've had a fantastic discussion this evening, and I think it's, when I think about the presentations, then that was very much focused on alternative data sources, integrating data, and really we've got a whole new brave world ahead of us in terms of how we can actually produce new things and integrate data. So we've got that. I think another thing that really resonated with me was the burning platform that we have in terms of, the real need. And Chris, Vincent, I really like what you said on the panel discussion about good data to focus the discussion and tell the story. But I think what we have to unpack is, well, what is the discussion and themes of the discussion that we want to focus on, but also how do we build something that isn't static? When I think about things like the system of national accounts, where it's quite static for many years, and then we have kind of big updates. How can we build something that's very flexible, given we've got all these new data opportunities in terms of integration and new methods? And I think we've heard as well that we've got a measurement framework that's being developed by Habitat, but actually having that conceptual framework which helps us to tell the stories and provides the common language is something that seems to be an element that we should be kind of thinking of developing. And I think I just want to finish off with was just like we talked about having partnerships for accessing data, so we can use much more non-survey data and integrate it. We also need to partner together. And I think it's been really good to hear different countries' perspectives, but also have some kind of non-national statistical organisations contributions from an international organisation perspective, but also kind of non-government perspective as well. So thank you everybody for presenting. Big thanks to the presenters, the panelists, the people that have contributed to questions in the chat. And I look forward to having the next discussion. I hope you all have a good day or night, and hopefully the person's not going to try and get in my hotel room again. So good night. And I look forward to seeing you all again online or in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.